80 years ago, Nazi Germany collapsed. Its leaders hunted, tried, or executed. We know their names. We know their crimes. But what about the children they left behind? The sons and daughters who grew up in marble halls and manicured gardens, who played with exotic pets on stolen estates, and called men like Hitler Uncle Adolf. For them, the fall of the Reich was not just the end of a war. It was the end of the world. Some defended their fathers to the grave. Some disappeared into exile and false identities. And some chose to confront the truth head-on, no matter how much it cost. This is the untold story of the children of Nazi leaders after World War II. A journey from gilded childhoods and propaganda-fed illusions to trials, exile, denial, and, for a few, redemption. Welcome to GeoStrat, where we uncover the legacies, power struggles, and hidden forces that shape our world. Stay with us as we follow these lives from the golden cage of the Third Reich into the long, complicated shadows it left behind. The golden cage. Childhood in the Third Reich. They grew up in a world sealed off from the rest of humanity. A golden cage, built from stolen wealth and protected by the guns of the Reich. These were not ordinary children. They were the sons and daughters of Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, Hess, Bormann, Speer. Their playgrounds were the sprawling estates of Nazi high command. Their toys, rare art, priceless antiques, even exotic animals, plundered from across Europe. At Göring's estate, Karenhall, little Edda was the kleine Prinzessin, the little princess. She rode ponies through private forests where bison roamed freely and played beside lion cubs brought in for her amusement. For her christening, her godfather was none other than Adolf Hitler himself. At Obersalzberg, the children of Martin Bormann roamed the alpine meadows, far from the cities their father's orders were turning to rubble. To them, the Führer wasn't a dictator. He was Uncle Adolf. He gave them gifts, told them stories, patted them on the head with a smile. For Gudrun Himmler, daughter of the SS Reichsführer, life was an endless pageant of devotion to father and Führer. Himmler flew her to Berlin, called her every day when he was away, and wrote her letters filled with affection. She accompanied him to official events, smiling for photographers as though she were royalty. And in her diary, even a visit to the Dachau concentration camp seemed harmless. It was very nice, she wrote. For these children, truth was not discovered. It was imposed, and the cage they lived in, gilded though it was, would one day shatter. When it did, the world outside would not look on them with adoration, but with disgust, suspicion, and sometimes hatred. The fall of the Reich. By 1945, the Reich was dying. The luxury, the control, the certainty these children had known was collapsing under the relentless advance of the Allies. The fathers who had once seemed invincible were now hunted men. The homes that had been palaces became targets. The forests where the little princesses played were scarred by craters and smoke. Inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the Goebbels children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Huldine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, waited in dim concrete rooms. As Soviet artillery shook the ground above, Albert Speer offered to smuggle them to safety. Magda Goebbels refused. She told friends there could be no life worth living in a world without National Socialism. In Obersalzberg, Edda Göring and her mother Emmy watched as Allied bombs reduced parts of the Nazi leadership compound to rubble. At Dachau, American troops were closing in, and Heinrich Himmler was already planning his escape, while Gudrun and her mother Margaret fled south. Some children were evacuated in secret convoys, escorted by loyal SS men. Others were left behind in the chaos to face the incoming storm alone. As the Red Army pushed into Berlin, the bunker descended into a macabre stillness. The Goebbels children, dressed in their night clothes, were sedated with morphine by an SS dentist. And then Magda, with ice-cold determination, crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths. She laid their lifeless bodies in bed, brushed their hair, tied ribbons in the girls' hair, a grotesque parody of maternal care. Elsewhere, not all endings came so swiftly. Some fathers fled into hiding, leaving wives and children to fend for themselves. Martin Bormann's children were scattered, placed with Catholic foster families who didn't know who they were. Joseph Mengele disappeared to South America, abandoning his young son Rolf to grow up under a false narrative of heroism. For those children, the fall of the Reich was not a single moment, but a drawn-out descent into a reality they had never been prepared for. The flags, the uniforms, the applause, gone, replaced by hunger, suspicion, and the knowledge. Captured. As the Nazi Empire crumbled, the children of its leaders were no longer protected by walls of privilege. The victors of war came for the generals and for their families. Gudrun Himmler was just 16 when American soldiers intercepted her and her mother on the road to South Tyrol. They were arrested, searched, and in the lining of Margaret Himmler's coat, officers found a hidden vial of potassium cyanide. To the Allies, this was not just a frightened family, but the flesh and blood of the man who had overseen the Holocaust. Edda Göring and her mother were captured in the Bavarian Alps and taken to the Palace Hotel in Luxembourg, converted into an internment center for high-profile prisoners. Here, the little princess, who once had lion cubs for pets, was now under armed guard, eating rations in a crowded dining hall. The Bormann children, their father missing and presumed dead, were rounded up by occupying forces. Some were too young to understand. Others were already old enough to fear what came next. In the Allied camps, the treatment of these children varied. They were not formally charged with crimes, but neither were they free. Many were interrogated about their fathers, asked to remember private conversations, family visitors, anything that could be used at the Nuremberg Trials. For some, the shock was immediate. The man they'd called Papa, or Fati, was now described as a murderer, a war criminal, a monster. Others refused to believe it. Gudrun Himmler stunned her interrogators with her defiance, insisting that all accusations against her father were Allied propaganda. The imprisonment could last months or years. During that time, the carefully crafted illusions of childhood began to fracture. Some children began to sense the enormity of what had happened. Others clung tighter to denial, the last shield against a world they no longer understood. When they were finally released, there was no return to the old life. The grand estates were confiscated. The uniforms and medals were gone. In their place was a dangerous name that followed them everywhere. The trials. For the children of Nazi leaders, the Nuremberg Trials were more than world history. They were a public dissection of their families, broadcast to the world. In the cold geometry of the courtroom, The fathers they once idolized sat behind glass, no longer untouchable rulers, but prisoners awaiting judgment. Every word, every damning photograph, every reel of film documenting atrocities was another hammer blow against the image of Papa. Edda Göring visited her father in his cell, pressing her hands against the glass, unable to reconcile the man who had taught her to ride a pony with the man accused of orchestrating plunder and death on an unimaginable scale. Wolf Rüdiger Hess listened to the proceedings against his father, Rudolf Hess, the man who had once stood beside Hitler, and heard him described as a delusional conspirator, guilty of crimes against peace. To Wolf, it was a betrayal by history. To the world, it was justice. For some children, the trials were the beginning of a lifelong break with their families. Niklas Frank, too young to attend, but old enough to later read every transcript, would grow to hate the father he had once revered. Others, like Gudrun Himmler, dismissed the entire process as a staged show trial, a victory parade for the Allies. The trials were not swift. Months turned into years as evidence was gathered and verdicts delivered. Death sentences, life imprisonments, long decades in Spandau. And for the children, the sentences were not on paper. They were lived. A name that could not be changed. A shadow that could not be escaped. An inheritance of guilt that would follow them through every school, every job interview, every whispered conversation. Exile and survival. When the verdicts were read and the courtroom lights went dark, the world moved on. But for the children of Nazi leaders, there was no clean break. The war had left them homeless, hunted, and in many cases, despised. Their estates stripped, bank accounts frozen, relatives scattered, hiding, or dead. Edda Göring went from a palace surrounded by stolen Renaissance art to a cabin with no electricity, no running water, and no guarantee of safety. Gudrun Himmler and her mother wandered through a chain of Allied camps. Italy, France, Germany, always under watch, always questioned, never fully free. Some families fled across borders in the dead of night. The Eichmann children boarded ships bound for South America under false names. Klaus Eichmann would later move through Buenos Aires like a ghost, his father hidden in plain sight, surrounded by a web of exiled comrades. Others tried to fade into the rubble of post-war Germany. Brigitte Hess, daughter of the Auschwitz commandant, changed her identity entirely, living decades under a new name in the United States. Her past a locked room she never allowed anyone to enter. And there were those who never left the ideology behind. Klaus Barbie's daughter grew up in Bolivia. Her father's crimes whispered about in bars, defended in certain circles with the same rhetoric that had fueled the Reich. For many, survival meant erasing themselves, choosing exile not just from nations, but from their own names. For others, survival meant doubling down, guarding the past like a sacred relic, no matter how much it poisoned the present. The war was over, but the battle over memory and truth had only just begun. Denial and devotion. For some, the war's end was not the end of loyalty. It was the beginning of a lifelong mission. They were the keepers of the old narrative, the defenders of fathers the world had condemned as monsters. Gudrun Himmler became the most famous of them all, the Nazi princess, a title whispered in both contempt and reverence. To her, Heinrich Himmler was not the architect of the Holocaust, but a wronged patriot. She collected every clipping, every mention of his name. She wrote rebuttals in the margins, line by line. She joined Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, the shadowy network aiding fugitive SS men. She shook hands with unrepentant war criminals, funded their defenses, and attended secret gatherings deep into the 21st century. When she died in 2018, her home was a shrine. Framed portraits of her father, SS relics carefully polished, and a silver swastika brooch she had worn since she was a teenager. Wolf Rüdiger Hess took the same path. His father, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, had spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison after his failed peace mission to Britain. Wolf dedicated his own life to freeing him. He wrote books defending his father's honor, accusing the Allies of murder after Hess's death in 1987. Every year, he organized memorial marches, drawing neo-Nazis from across Europe, until his own death in 2001. He refused to utter a word of regret. Even decades later, Martin Adolf Bormann, Hitler's godson and son of his powerful private secretary, would never fully denounce his father. Though he sought a spiritual life in the Catholic Church, his public statements always balanced between disapproval and filial love. A tightrope walked in the shadow of history's judgment. For these men and women, their fathers' legacies were not chains to be broken, but banners to be carried. The Reich had fallen, but in their hearts, it had never surrendered. Reckoning and redemption. Not all chose silence. Not all chose loyalty. Some turned their backs on the shadows of their childhood and walked toward the light of truth, no matter how painful. Niklas Frank was one of them, the son of Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, who oversaw the slaughter of millions. Niklas did not seek to protect his father's memory. He sought to destroy it. As a journalist, he spoke openly, even brutally, about his father's crimes. In his searing book, The Father: A Reckoning, he called Hans Frank a monster, a cultured killer who signed execution orders while listening to Mozart. He toured schools, gave interviews, and told young Germans, "Do not look away, do not forgive." Monika Hertwig, daughter of Oman Goeth, the sadistic camp commandant immortalized in Schindler's List, lived in ignorance for decades. Her mother told her that Goethe was a good man, a soldier doing his duty. Then came the film. Then came the truth. The knowledge broke her and remade her. In 2008, she met Helen Jonas, a Jewish survivor forced to work as her father's servant, standing together on the ruins of Goethe's villa. They shared tears and silence. A silence that said more than any words could. Others chose transformation through service. Martin Bormann Jr., son of Hitler's private secretary, turned to the priesthood. He spent years as a missionary in Africa, dedicating himself to care and compassion, the polar opposite of his father's legacy. Though he admitted he could never absolve his father, he believed in the possibility of a redeemed soul. And then there was Rainer Höss, grandson of Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz. A school trip to Dachau shattered his illusions. He became an outspoken activist against Holocaust denial, returning stolen family possessions to survivors' families, speaking at memorials, standing, quite literally, on the ground where his grandfather had ruled over death. These were the ones who chose a harder path, not the comfort of loyalty, not the refuge of silence, but the lifelong work of truth-telling. They carried their fathers' names and made them mean something different. The legacy lives on the war ended 8 decades ago. The Nazi leaders are gone. Their children are now old, and in many cases, gone as well. But the legacy remains. For the grandchildren, the third generation, the past is not something to be discovered. It is something they were born into. Their task is not to learn what happened, but to decide what to do with it. Some have embraced the work of memory. Gudrun Himmler, great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, became a historian, writing The Himmler Brothers, a brutally honest examination of how her family became architects of genocide. Jennifer Teger, granddaughter of Oman Goeth, learned her heritage by accident, picking up a book and seeing her mother's face on the cover. She is black, the daughter of a Nigerian father. Under Nazi law, she would have been deemed racially inferior by the same man who was her grandfather. Her book, My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me, confronts that paradox with unflinching courage. Others choose silence, living under new names in new countries, cutting all ties to a past that still burns like a brand. For them, the best way to break the chain is to let the name die with them. And some cannot bear the thought of passing that legacy forward. Bettina Göring, great niece of Hermann Göring, once said, "I cut myself off from the possibility of creating another Göring." She chose sterilization, believing, wrongly but viscerally, that she might carry tainted blood. The world they inhabit is not the one their grandparents tried to build, but the shadows of that world are still there. In history books, in memorial stones, and in the faces of those who carry these names. They are not responsible for what was done, but they are connected to it, through blood, through memory, through the unspoken weight of a surname. And so, in quiet ways and loud ones, in classrooms and documentaries, in books and in private conversations, the descendants of Nazi leaders shape how we remember and how we choose not to forget. Because in the end, the story of the children of the Reich is not just about guilt or innocence. It is about the responsibility of memory. The names change, the faces age, but the past never really leaves. The story of the children of the Reich is not just history. It is a mirror. It asks us who we are and what we will do with the legacies we inherit. Because forgetting is easy, but remembering takes work. And in that work lies the only hope of breaking the cycle. If this story made you think, share it so others can remember too. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective matters in the conversation we must keep alive. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden stories of history, subscribe to GeoStrat. Because in every name, every shadow, and every memory lies the story of our world.